What if the stories we celebrate are only half the truth? What about the soldiers who fought, endured, and risked everything, yet vanished from history? How did a group of Black Marines, outnumbered and underestimated, survive Iwo Jima when the world didn't expect them to? Their courage was real, their heroism invisible, but what they endured could change the way we see history forever. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. February of 1944 in the Deep South was a landscape of contradictions. Fields stretched under the relentless sun, crops bending to the wind, the scent of earth and sweat mingling with the distant hum of industry that seemed to belong to another world. Augustus Walker, known simply as Gus to those who dared approach him with familiarity, walked through the narrow streets of his hometown with a sense of purpose heavier than the bag he carried on his shoulder. The letters on the corner store window, weathered and yellowed, whispered of a world he had never known, yet now felt inevitable. He had spent his youth watching the hands of his parents labor tirelessly, seeing their dignity clash with the invisible walls of segregation. And now, at 22, with muscles honed from field work and a mind sharpened by the quiet intelligence of necessity, Gus felt the pull of a calling that transcended both fear and the familiar rhythms of his town. The recruitment office was a small brick building with a faded sign that read, in letters peeling at the edges, Marines Enlistment, open to Negro applicants. The words themselves carried a weight of contradiction. Open, but not equal. Inclusive, but still segregated. Gus felt the irony gnaw at him, yet he stepped inside with a resolve that had nothing to do with the boundaries drawn by others. His hands, calloused and strong, gripped the edges of the counter as he signed his name, each stroke of the pen a quiet defiance against a world that often overlooked him. The clerk, a man older than Gus and worn by years of bureaucracy, glanced at him briefly and said nothing. The silence itself seemed to mark the beginning of something larger, an acknowledgement without words. Letters were written that evening, in the dim glow of a single lamp that cast shadows across the wooden floorboards. His mother, a woman whose hands bore the map of decades of toil, sat quietly, watching her son with eyes that knew both pride and apprehension. "They'll send you far from here," she said softly, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "And the world? It won't be kind. But remember who you are, Augustus. Always." Her words, a blend of warning and blessing, settled in him like stones pressed into the soil of his consciousness. He held her hands in his own, feeling the pulse of generations, and promised silently that he would carry not just his own survival, but the dignity of those whose names history might try to erase. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Gus trained at Montford Point, a place that was at once harsh and isolating. The sun scorched the barracks roof, the sand burned beneath feet unaccustomed to relief, and the trainers, white and stern, drilled them with a rigor that was almost mechanical in its cruelty. Yet, within the ranks, bonds formed quietly, like the slow weaving of threads into fabric. Other young Black men, each carrying their own burdens of expectation and erasure, became comrades, each step in formation a declaration of resilience. They learned to carry their packs as if bearing both their bodies and the weight of the world's doubts. They marched, they ran, they lifted, they fell, and each time they rose, the truth became clearer. Their strength was not merely physical. It was the measure of their resolve to exist in a world that often refused to see them. Letters of departure arrived unexpectedly, crisp and official, marking the transition from preparation to the unknown. Gus read the words aloud to his barracks mates, and for a fleeting moment, the reality of the journey ahead settled over them like a fog. He would leave the familiar grounds of training for the distant, volcanic islands of the Pacific, Iwo Jima, a name that would later be etched in history, but for now existed only as a whisper, a promise of fire and sand, and the unyielding test of courage. As he packed his few belongings, the significance of each object became amplified. A photo of his mother, a locket of his father's hair, a notebook with blank pages waiting to record the story of a life thrust into the tides of war. On the morning of departure, Gus stood on the dock, the horizon stretching endlessly beyond the water, the air thick with salt and anticipation. The ship awaited, massive and indifferent, ready to carry men to a conflict that would test not only their skill, but their very essence. He took a deep breath, feeling the pull of the ocean and the pull of destiny entwined. With one last glance at the town that had shaped him, the fields that had hardened him, and the family that had anchored him, Gus stepped forward. Each step was deliberate, a rhythm that matched the beating of a heart both eager and wary. He did not know what awaited him on the other side, nor did he know how the world would receive him. But within that uncertainty lay a singular certainty. He would not merely survive, he would assert his presence in a war that sought to overlook him, and in doing so, he would begin a journey whose echoes would stretch far beyond the battlefield. Montford Point was a place of discipline and isolation, a crucible designed to forge men into Marines, yet it also bore the weight of the world's blind prejudices. Augustus Walker, now no longer just Gus, but Private Walker to the officers and sergeants who drilled him daily, moved through the compound with a rhythm learned from endless repetition. The sun seared the sand beneath his boots, each grain pressing against the soles like a quiet reminder of the endurance expected of him. Here, he and his fellow black recruits were segregated, not by choice, but by decree, and the irony was inescapable. They were asked to prepare for the fiercest combat the world had known, to become guardians of liberty, yet in the eyes of the world and even their own military, they were considered somehow incomplete, untested, not fully worthy. The drills were relentless, hours of formation, weapons assembly, timed marches, obstacle courses designed to break the body and, perhaps more cruelly, to challenge the spirit. Each fall, each stumble, each missed command was catalogued, scrutinized, a silent accusation that they were less than the men who trained alongside them elsewhere. Gus learned quickly that endurance was not merely measured by physical exertion. It was a matter of will, of refusing to internalize the doubts cast upon him by others. He rose before dawn, his body still heavy from the previous day's exercises, and pushed himself beyond exhaustion, the repetition of each motion a mantra. I am here. I am capable. I am necessary. Within the ranks, camaraderie flourished quietly, invisible to the trainers who rarely acknowledged them. These men, bound together by circumstance and shared defiance, became a living testament to resilience. They whispered words of encouragement, exchanged small gestures of solidarity, and shared their ambitions for a world that might one day recognize their worth. In those moments, Gus understood that survival was not simply about obeying commands. It was about preserving the integrity of self against a tide of systemic dismissal. Despite the hardships, there were fleeting moments of pride. Gus watched as a fellow recruit, lighter-skinned and older, managed to surpass the expectations of the training officers, earning brief, begrudging recognition. Yet even then, the acknowledgement was tempered with limitation, a reminder that their victories were always partial, always shadowed by a societal reluctance to fully embrace them. Gus internalized this tension, transforming it into a quiet fire that propelled him forward. Each drill, each march, each loaded pack became not merely a task, but a challenge to the very notion that he was expendable, that his service was less significant. The letters he received from home, postmarked and faded, offered both comfort and urgency. His mother wrote of the small triumphs of daily life, of the community that persisted despite constraints, of the expectation that he carry himself with honor, even when the world refused to acknowledge it. These words became talismans against despair, reminders that he fought not just for survival, but for recognition, for the dignity of a people long overlooked in the annals of history. The dichotomy of his existence, between the rigorous demands of the Corps and the societal chains of segregation, shaped every thought, every decision. Gus realized that to endure here was to assert presence in a place that sought to render him invisible. Weeks passed, each day folding into the next with mechanical precision. The distant echoes of artillery from the Pacific Theater, the whispers of battles yet to come, and the unspoken knowledge that he might soon face life or death combined into a persistent tension that weighed upon him. When orders arrived, delivered with the sterile clarity of military protocol, they were a confirmation of both fear and purpose. He would leave Montford Point, leave the confines of the segregated training camp, and step into the vast uncertainty of the Pacific War. The news brought a complex blend of relief and apprehension. Relief, because the waiting and proving was ending. Apprehension, because the reality of combat, far more formidable than any drill or obstacle course, awaited him. Gus gathered his belongings, each item charged with meaning. A letter from his mother folded neatly within his jacket, a photograph of his father's solemn face, and a small notebook waiting to record the events that would define him. The weight of the pack pressed against his shoulders, yet it felt lighter than the burden of what he carried within. A determination to exist fully, to be counted, to challenge the assumption that his life and service could be overlooked. As he prepared to depart, he felt the silent gaze of his companions, men who shared the same unspoken understanding that they were stepping into a world that had yet to recognize their courage. In that moment, the collective heartbeat of the group seemed to sync with his own. A steady, unyielding rhythm, a signal that despite the shadows of segregation, they would endure. The day of departure came with a quiet solemnity. Gus stepped onto the transport vessel, the expanse of water stretching endlessly before him, a barrier between the life he knew and the unknown that awaited. The air carried a mixture of salt and anticipation, the horizon both a promise and a threat. Each step onto the deck was deliberate, a silent proclamation that he would not merely follow orders, but assert his presence in a war that sought to forget him. As the ship began to move, cutting through the dark water with determined precision, Gus felt the enormity of what lay ahead. The world would test him, attempt to diminish him, but he carried within him a resolve forged in the fields of his youth, tempered in the crucible of Montford Point, and anchored by the unwavering belief that survival was not enough. He would endure with purpose, and in doing so, begin to carve a place for his story in a history that too often left men like him unnamed. February 1945 arrived with a cold wind that cut through the dense Pacific air as Augustus Walker stepped onto the shores of Iwo Jima. The island greeted him not with open arms, but with the unforgiving weight of its volcanic soil. Blackened sands stretching like a canvas of despair, cratered and scarred by previous bombardments. Smoke rose in irregular columns, twisting into the sky, carrying the scent of sulfur and gunpowder, mingling with the salt and humidity that clung to every surface. Each step he took pressed his boots into the scorched earth, a tactile reminder that this was no longer a training ground, no longer a place where mistakes could be corrected with patience. Here, survival demanded more than strength or skill. It demanded presence of mind, an unwavering capacity to act while chaos tore at the senses. Gus's assignment, like those of many of his fellow Black Marines, was logistical, moving supplies, delivering ammunition, ensuring that the men on the front lines would not falter for lack of resources. The role, critical yet largely invisible to the pages of history, required him to navigate trenches and shell-cratered paths under constant threat. Yet in the minds of the Japanese defenders, the presence of Black Marines remained a mystery. Reports filtered back through intercepted communications spoke of units that pressed forward with unusual determination, of men who carried not just loads of supplies, but an unyielding resolve that seemed to defy numbers, defy expectation, defy the conventional calculations of war. The whispers were faint, almost imperceptible, but they hinted at an anomaly. The enemy could not comprehend the force of those whom they had presumed would falter. Every day, Gus felt the weight of dual expectations, his own, to perform and survive, and the implicit expectation of history that he might yet be forgotten. Alongside him was Sergeant Lena Moore, a woman whose discipline mirrored his own, her voice calm and decisive amid the cacophony of conflict. She had joined the Corps for reasons not unlike his, a pursuit of duty, yes, but also a claim to visibility, to recognition that had long been denied. Together, they formed an unspoken pact. The tasks they were given might seem secondary, yet each carried the potential to alter the course of lives around them. Gus understood that moving a crate of ammunition across open terrain could mean the difference between life and death for those holding the line. Every calculation, every measured step, was an act of silent heroism, a defiance of the invisible boundaries that sought to minimize them. The sun climbed higher each day, beating down on men already exhausted by nights without rest, by the constant roar of distant artillery, by the anticipation of sudden attacks. Yet in the midst of this relentless rhythm, moments of clarity arrived. A shared glance with Lena, the brief acknowledgement of a fellow Marine who had successfully delivered his load, the realization that survival required not just physical endurance, but the mastery of fear. Gus began to sense that the island itself was a living entity, a challenge designed to test not only bodies, but minds, a theater where courage was measured in microseconds, in the weight of a single action carried out under fire. The sand burned, yet it was here that he discovered the depths of his own determination. Nightfall brought no relief, only a shifting of dangers. The darkened landscape became a labyrinth, shadows concealing both threat and opportunity. Gus moved with caution, relying on instincts honed in both the fields of his youth and the harsh routines of Montford Point. The distant flashes of artillery illuminated his path intermittently, painting the black sand in shades of gray and red, the sky above a canvas of fire and smoke. In these hours, the idea of invisibility took on a tangible form. To survive was to navigate a world that sought to erase him, that would not acknowledge the stakes of his labor, the significance of his presence. Yet he persisted, carrying not only physical loads, but the quiet dignity of those whose service might never be commemorated in print or photograph. By the end of the third day, the toll of combat and labor was etched into every movement. Yet Gus sensed a subtle shift within himself. The fear remained, but it had been tempered by rhythm and repetition, by observation and adaptation. The enemy, though formidable, had not broken him. The terrain, though unrelenting, had not vanquished him. With each step across the black sands, with each crate of ammunition delivered to the front, he carved a space in a narrative that too often excluded men like him. And though the Japanese soldiers might never understand how these men, outnumbered and underestimated, pressed forward with unwavering resolve, Gus felt within himself a profound affirmation. He belonged here, in this crucible, and he would endure. As dawn approached on the fourth day, the horizon remained unbroken, smoke still spiraling skyward, and Gus felt the weight of both expectation and purpose settle within him. The island demanded sacrifice, yet it also demanded presence, vigilance, and courage. He moved forward once more, the black sands beneath his boots both a burden and a testament. Each step was deliberate, a statement of intent. He would not only survive, he would insist on being remembered. The war, it seemed, was as much about carving out recognition as it was about any battle, and Gus was determined to claim both. The days on Iwo Jima blurred together under the relentless pulse of battle, a ceaseless rhythm of earth-shaking detonations, shouts carried on the wind, and the acrid taste of smoke that clung to every breath. Augustus Walker, carrying the weight of both responsibility and expectation, moved through this chaos with a measured determination. His hands were raw, fingers blistered from hauling ammunition and heavy equipment, yet he did not falter. The front lines were a living entity, shifting unpredictably with each passing hour, and the men he supported depended on his endurance as much as his own life depended on their survival. Each delivery of supplies was a negotiation with chance, each step across the cratered terrain a testament to the capacity to persist when the world seemed determined to erase him. Gus and Sergeant Lena Moore received a mission that carried extraordinary risk. A critical cache of artillery shells, essential for the continuation of the offensive, had been isolated near an embattled ridge. The path was treacherous, exposed, and the enemy's presence was undeniable. For those who watched only the famous images of Iwo Jima, this would have appeared as chaos, but for those within it, every motion was calculated, every heartbeat synchronized with an unspoken awareness of danger. Gus felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Not the history written in newspapers or commemorated in photographs, but the history he and his companions were living, each action a contribution to a story that might never be acknowledged. The realization sharpened his focus. Their significance lay in the doing, in the endurance, in the refusal to allow circumstances to diminish their value. The ridge lay ahead like a wound in the earth, a scarred monument to both the fury of men and the indifference of the landscape. Enemy fire spattered across the terrain, cutting into the sand and rocks with jagged precision. Gus felt the rhythm of battle pulse through his body, an unspoken dialogue between survival instinct and duty. Lena's presence beside him was a steadying force. Her calm commands, precise and unyielding, reminded him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Together, they navigated the treacherous path, balancing the physical demands of their mission with the mental discipline required to withstand constant threat. Each crate lifted, each step forward, was an assertion against the chaos, a refusal to be rendered invisible in a conflict that seemed indifferent to the individual. As they reached the edge of the ridge, Gus's awareness expanded to encompass the entirety of their situation. The frontline Marines were depleted, their ammunition waning, and the enemy's positions entrenched and relentless. It was not merely a delivery of supplies that he was executing, it was an act of preservation, a thread holding together the fragile tapestry of survival. Every action carried weight, every decision held consequence. Gus knew that one misstep could unravel not only his own safety, but that of those relying on him. And yet, in the intensity of the moment, a strange clarity emerged. The fear that had been a constant companion transformed into a focused determination, a quiet resolve that this mission, and the countless others like it, were opportunities to assert worth in a world that often denied it. The enemy remained unpredictable, their movements calculated, yet obscured, a shadow of menace that required constant vigilance. Gus and Lena moved with a disciplined fluidity, responding to threats with precision, communicating with minimal words, each gesture significant. The ridge demanded courage, measured not in grand gestures, but in quiet persistence. Gus felt the presence of those who had come before him, the men and women who had labored, endured, and fought under the weight of society's dismissal, and he carried that legacy forward with every motion. The rhythm of the island, the cadence of conflict, became intertwined with his own heartbeat, a symphony of endurance that defined both his mission and his existence in this theater of war. By the end of the day, they had secured the supplies, their task completed though not without cost. The exhaustion was profound, but a deep awareness of accomplishment tempered it. Gus recognized that their actions, though perhaps unnoticed by history in the grand narrative, were no less vital. They had traversed danger with deliberate intent, sustaining life and momentum where chaos reigned. And in this realization, there was a quiet, almost defiant satisfaction. They had asserted their presence, claimed significance, and demonstrated resilience in the face of a world that often assumed otherwise. Even in the shadows, even at the edge of the line, Augustus Walker understood that courage and purpose were not always measured by recognition, but by the steadfast refusal to yield. The days stretched into a continuum of fire, smoke, and relentless movement, each moment pressing upon Augustus Walker with a weight that was both tangible and psychological. The ridge had been secured, but the island offered no respite. The enemy, elusive and resolute, remained embedded within a network of caves and fortifications, striking with a precision born of desperation and knowledge of the terrain. Gus and Sergeant Lena Moore received word of a forward trench where Marines were pinned, ammunition dwindling and morale fragile. The task was clear: deliver critical supplies directly into the teeth of enemy positions. The prospect was formidable, yet there was no hesitation. Each Marine understood that hesitation on Iwo Jima was not merely dangerous, it was fatal. The terrain between them and the trench was a crucible of unpredictability. Craters punctuated the blackened soil, jagged and filled with water or debris, forcing Gus to navigate each step with a caution that bordered on instinct. Every rustle of sand, every echo of distant artillery was amplified in the mind, a reminder that danger existed in both the seen and unseen. Gus carried the crates of ammunition with the same deliberate intensity that had guided him through Montford Point. Yet here, the stakes were immeasurably higher. The enemy's presence was a shadow over every action, and the thought that the Japanese soldiers might never understand how men like him, outnumbered and underestimated, could advance with relentless determination only heightened his focus. The forward trench was a scene of exhaustion and tenuous survival. Marines crouched behind shattered earthworks, faces smeared with sweat and dirt, eyes reflecting the strain of continuous bombardment. Gus and Lena moved among them, distributing the ammunition with efficiency and care, offering words of encouragement that were as vital as the supplies themselves. Each exchange, each measured motion, carried weight beyond the immediate task. It was an affirmation that in the midst of chaos, order, courage, and presence could persist. Gus recognized that this was more than a supply run. It was a moral act, a claim to relevance and dignity in a war that often overlooked men like him. A sudden movement caught his attention. A Japanese soldier emerged from a nearby dugout, exposed for only a heartbeat. The instinct to act surged, yet Gus hesitated, the human instinct clashing with the trained reflex. In that fraction of a second, he glimpsed the complexity of the enemy. Not faceless opposition, but individuals caught in the same machinery of survival and expectation. He raised his weapon, the decision measured, deliberate, and necessary. The encounter passed as quickly as it arrived, yet the impression lingered. War demanded not only action, but awareness, not only courage, but ethical judgment, and the consequences of each choice were immediate and irrevocable. As the day progressed, Gus and Lena continued their mission, moving from trench to trench, each delivery a small victory in the larger, grinding struggle. The men they supported, though exhausted and frayed, found in their presence a reinforcement of endurance and hope. Gus began to internalize a profound truth. Heroism was not always commemorated, not always captured in photographs or recorded in reports. Here, in the trenches, heroism was persistence under fire, the willingness to carry not only ammunition, but the burden of survival for those around him. Even as darkness began to fall, the threat did not abate. The terrain remained treacherous, and the enemy still lurked, invisible yet present, a constant reminder that respite was temporary. Gus and Lena moved with the practiced precision of shared experience, communicating with minimal gestures, every motion purposeful. They were not merely delivering supplies, they were sustaining life, morale, and the fragile thread of order amid chaos. Each step, each hand extended with aid, each decision to act under fire, reinforced the assertion that their presence mattered. In the relentless crucible of Iwo Jima, Gus understood that significance was not always acknowledged by the world, yet it was affirmed in the act itself, in the refusal to yield, in the courage to persist when all odds seemed against them. By the end of the operation, the trench was resupplied, the immediate threat mitigated, yet exhaustion weighed heavily on the men. Gus felt the combined toll of physical strain and mental vigilance, yet beneath it lingered a quiet, unwavering pride. They had faced the enemy directly, delivered what was needed, and asserted their place in a narrative that had long overlooked men like them. In the midst of fire and chaos, in the shadow of unseen enemies, Augustus Walker grasped a singular truth. Courage is not measured by recognition, but by presence, resolve, and the refusal to vanish when the world expects it. The eruption of gunfire on Iwo Jima had become a constant backdrop, an unrelenting rhythm against which Augustus Walker measured his every movement. Beyond the immediate chaos of the battlefield, there was another conflict, quieter yet equally formidable, the struggle for recognition, for validation in a world that had long ignored men like him. From a distance, he watched the famous raising of the flag atop Mount Suribachi, an image that would be immortalized, revered, and repeated endlessly. Yet none of the Black Marines who had labored to make that moment possible were captured in its frame. It was not resentment that filled him, but a profound understanding of the invisible weight carried by those who fought without acknowledgement. Their contributions were woven into the fabric of victory, unseen threads that held together the larger tapestry. Gus moved through the trenches, the rhythm of combat familiar now, his body conditioned to the constant strain of carrying supplies, aiding wounded comrades, and sustaining the line. Beside him, Sergeant Lena Moore spoke with quiet authority, her orders precise and deliberate. She had proven herself repeatedly, her presence a testament to skill and perseverance in a corps that had often doubted her worth. Together, they navigated the scarred terrain, understanding that the significance of their actions was not always measured by public accolades, but by the survival and success of those whose lives they directly influenced. Each delivery of ammunition, each ration passed to a weary Marine, each stabilization of a fractured line was an assertion of presence, a subtle defiance against the erasure that history often imposed. The island tested endurance not only through external threats, but through psychological strain. Gus felt the weight of absence, the absence of recognition, the absence of those who had fallen, the absence of a world willing to see his worth. He thought of the families back home, of the letters from his mother urging him to carry himself with dignity, and of the quiet resolve that had driven him through Montford Point and onto these shores. The paradox was constant: to act with courage while knowing the world might never notice, to excel while expecting obscurity, to endure while shouldering the expectation of being invisible. It was a tension that sharpened his focus, made each decision more deliberate, each step more meaningful. During a brief lull in combat, Gus and Lena paused beside a crumbling wall of sandbags. The air was thick with smoke and the faint, acrid scent of spent gunpowder. Lena spoke of legacy, of stories that were recorded not in photographs but in memory, in whispered accounts, in the courage carried forward by those who survived. Gus understood this implicitly. They were participants in a struggle larger than themselves, their actions rippling outward in ways that might never be fully documented, but were no less real. He recognized the paradox of being both central and invisible, of shaping history while being left out of its most celebrated images. The lull ended abruptly, the silence shattered by the staccato rhythm of incoming fire. Gus and Lena resumed their work, each movement deliberate, each action a reaffirmation of presence and purpose. The men they aided relied on them, yet the broader world might never know, and that was no excuse for hesitation. Every supply carried, every injured comrade assisted, every decision made in the shadow of constant threat became a quiet testament to the resilience that history had not yet chosen to acknowledge. In that crucible of fire, smoke, and black sand, Gus felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him, not only for the immediate survival of those around him, but for the unrecorded valor of all who served unseen. As night approached, the flag atop Mount Suribachi still stood, the image immortalized elsewhere, while the real work continued quietly in the trenches below. Gus understood that significance was not always commemorated in history books or photographs, but in the persistence, courage, and deliberate defiance of those who refused to vanish. In every measured step, every hand extended to aid another, every crate of ammunition carried through peril, he asserted a presence that would endure beyond recognition. It was here, in these unrecorded acts, that true valor resided, quiet but undeniable, and Gus carried that truth with unwavering resolve into the uncertain hours that awaited. The toll of Iwo Jima weighed upon Augustus Walker with a relentless gravity, a burden both visible and internalized. Days bled into nights, each marked by the rhythm of gunfire, explosions, and the desperate effort to carry supplies across terrain scarred by volcanic eruptions and relentless bombardment. The physical exhaustion was profound, yet it was the invisible wounds, the quiet reckonings of survival and witness that pressed most heavily upon him. Comrades, friends who had trained and marched alongside him, were gone. Some were claimed by sudden artillery, others swallowed by the unrelenting heat and smoke that seemed to suffocate the very air. Every name lost became a weight in his chest, a reminder that courage often demanded payment, and that recognition was rarely granted in proportion to sacrifice. Gus paused in the blackened sand, feeling the weight of both fatigue and responsibility. He thought of Private Henry Jenkins, a young Marine whose laughter had once echoed through the barracks of Montford Point, now silenced by the unforgiving calculus of war. Reports filtered through of other Black Marines who had fallen in skirmishes elsewhere, their deaths largely unacknowledged in dispatches or photographs. The world, it seemed, was eager to remember some faces and erase others, a quiet injustice that gnawed at him with relentless insistence. Each loss, each absence, deepened his resolve. To survive was no longer enough. He carried the responsibility to bear witness, to remember, to ensure that the bravery of those who were often invisible was not forgotten entirely. Sergeant Lena Moore, walking beside him through the cratered landscape, had suffered her own injuries, minor yet constant reminders of vulnerability. Despite this, her authority remained steady, her presence a stabilizing force amid chaos. When she spoke, it was often of perseverance, of legacy, of the unrecorded valor that persisted even in obscurity. Gus absorbed these lessons, internalizing the notion that heroism need not be acknowledged publicly to be real. Each ration delivered, each crate of ammunition moved, each wounded comrade supported, became an act of defiance against erasure. In the midst of relentless threat, the quiet acts of courage became a private history, a ledger of survival and persistence that the island demanded be maintained. Letters from home reached him sporadically, their arrival a small but profound tether to a world beyond the battlefield. His mother's words, composed and deliberate, urged him to retain dignity and purpose. She reminded him that the trials of war were but another chapter in a life already conditioned to resilience. Each word became a talisman, a mental anchor against despair, and he carried them in his breast pocket alongside a photograph of his father, whose solemn eyes seemed to convey both caution and pride. The dichotomy of existence was constant, to operate with precision under mortal threat while sustaining the memory of those whose lives had been claimed, and to do so with a steadfast refusal to vanish into obscurity. The front lines shifted with unpredictability, and Gus moved through them with the rhythm of someone both burdened and focused. Each action was deliberate, each decision an exercise in measured courage. Enemy fire remained ever present, unpredictable, a reminder of mortality, yet it was the silent moments, the absence of recognition, the unacknowledged sacrifices that weighed most heavily. He found solace in the small victories: a wounded Marine stabilized, a supply line secured, a unit maintained despite the chaos. These acts, though invisible to the outside world, were evidence of persistence, evidence of a refusal to allow the forces of history, chance, or prejudice to render his comrades and himself insignificant. As dusk settled, bringing a brief reprieve from the white-hot glare of conflict, Gus reflected on the paradox of valor and recognition. The battlefield measured worth not by names recorded or photographs taken, but by endurance, presence, and deliberate action. He understood that his survival, and that of those around him, was inseparable from the courage displayed in each quiet, unheralded act. In this understanding lay a bitter clarity. History might overlook them, yet their impact, etched into the lives of those who persisted, was indelible. Augustus Walker felt, for the first time with full weight, the gravity of bearing witness not only to the enemy, but to the silence that often followed the heroism of men like him. The island of Iwo Jima had become an unforgiving furnace, a place where every step could be the difference between life and death. Augustus Walker felt the tension in his muscles, the ache in his joints, the relentless pounding of adrenaline that accompanied each heartbeat. The final offensive was underway, a push that demanded every ounce of physical strength and mental fortitude he possessed. The enemy's positions were entrenched, hidden in a labyrinth of caves and fortifications that defied conventional assault. Mortar shells and machine gun fire cut through the air in irregular bursts, each one a reminder that survival required vigilance, precision, and unwavering courage. Gus moved with the practiced rhythm that had carried him across black sands and cratered terrain, aware that hesitation now would carry consequences that could not be undone. Sergeant Lena Moore was beside him, her calm authority a counterbalance to the chaos surrounding them. The mission was extraordinary: move a heavy machine gun to a recently captured hill, a position that could turn the tide of localized engagement if reinforced. The terrain was unforgiving, steep and uneven, littered with debris from previous bombardments, and exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. Gus adjusted the straps of his pack, feeling the weight of both the weapon and the ammunition, each pound a tangible reminder of the stakes. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, smoke, and the iron tang of blood, mingling into a haze that pressed upon the senses and sharpened focus. Each step toward the hill was deliberate, measured against instinct and training. Gus had learned to listen to the rhythm of the battlefield, to interpret subtle shifts in sound, shadow, and movement that signaled danger before it fully emerged. He could hear the faint cracking of distant rifles, the muted rumble of artillery in the background, the hushed but urgent commands of his fellow Marines navigating the same perilous path. Every footfall, every carefully executed maneuver, was a negotiation with chance, a tacit acknowledgement that life here was contingent on focus, discipline, and the unrelenting resolve to act despite fear. As they reached the crest of the hill, the challenge intensified. The machine gun was unwieldy, heavy, yet essential. Gus and Lena coordinated with precision, synchronizing movements, distributing the load between strength and endurance, moving as if one body rather than two. Enemy fire intensified in sporadic bursts, and the blackened soil beneath them became a mosaic of shattered rock and smoke. Each placement of the weapon, each adjustment, was executed under the implicit understanding that failure could mean death for them and the men relying on them below. Gus felt the presence of all who had come before him, the unseen, the unacknowledged, guiding his hands, steadying his mind, lending resolve to the effort. Hours seemed to stretch infinitely as the operation continued. The weight of the machine gun was both literal and symbolic, a tangible representation of the burdens he had carried from Montford Point to this volcanic island. Every movement, every exertion was a reaffirmation of purpose, an assertion that despite obscurity, despite the expectations of a world that often ignored them, they had a role that mattered, a contribution that could not be erased. Gus and Lena succeeded in positioning the weapon, its presence now a force capable of influencing the flow of battle, yet the cost was etched into their bodies, minds, and spirits. Even in the midst of exhaustion and persistent danger, a clarity emerged. The final fire of the offensive was not merely about survival or victory, it was about endurance, presence, and the deliberate refusal to vanish. Gus recognized that every step across black sand, every crate carried, every calculated motion under the ceaseless fire was an act that transcended immediate necessity. It was testimony, a record of resilience, courage, and determination that, though invisible to history in the moment, would define him and his comrades in the broader, unspoken chronicle of men and women who persisted despite being overlooked. The hill, the machine gun, the relentless fire, all were now imprinted in him as markers of a truth unrecorded but undeniable. Presence, courage, and resolve endure even when recognition does not. The war had ended, but for Augustus Walker, the echoes of Iwo Jima remained a constant pulse beneath the surface of everyday life. Returning to the United States brought a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and an unsettling awareness of what awaited him beyond the Pacific. The streets of his hometown had changed little, yet everything felt different. Familiar faces greeted him, yet there was a quiet distance, an inability to comprehend fully the magnitude of what he had endured. The medals and commendations he received were modest, official acknowledgments of service that failed to capture the breadth of effort, the risks taken, and the sacrifices made. In the broader narrative of victory, Black Marines were rarely highlighted. Their presence, their endurance, their pivotal roles were frequently invisible, absent from headlines, photographs, and public memory. Gus walked among his family with a mixture of pride and quiet melancholy. His mother, whose hands had labored to sustain the household while he was away, held him close, her eyes filled with both relief and unspoken sorrow for those who did not return. He spoke to friends and neighbors about the war, but found that words often faltered against the enormity of the experience. How could he convey the weight of unseen heroism, the constant negotiation with fear, the burden of carrying both supplies, and the legacy of unacknowledged courage? Each story he attempted felt incomplete, truncated by the lack of audience capable of fully grasping its depth. In this silence, he realized that the war did not end at the beachhead or in the trenches. It continued within memory, carried as a hidden ledger of valor and endurance. Even within the military itself, the recognition of Black Marines remained muted. Units that had performed essential duties were often excluded from public ceremonies, their accomplishments subsumed under generalized reports of success. Gus understood that the societal structures that had dictated segregation at Montford Point had not vanished with the cessation of combat. Prejudice lingered quietly, subtly, often unnoticed except by those who bore it firsthand. Yet he had learned, in the crucible of Iwo Jima, that valor did not require acknowledgement to exist. Every decision, every measured movement under fire, every life sustained through his efforts was proof enough, presence and action were in themselves a record of significance. He carried the weight of memories, names of comrades lost, the rhythm of steps across black sands, the unending vigilance demanded by enemy fire. Some nights, he would revisit those moments silently, tracing the paths they had taken, replaying the deliveries, the rescues, the decisions made under pressure. The photographs that immortalized the flag rising on Mount Suribachi did not include him or most of his peers, yet he did not resent them. He simply recognized that history was partial, selective, and often indifferent to those who served unseen. In that understanding, he found resolve. The absence of acknowledgement was not a measure of his worth, nor of the value of his service. It was a call to preserve memory, to witness, to ensure that the truth of their actions endured in some form, however quiet. Gus resolved to record his experience, to write the unspoken chronicle of those who had labored and fought without visibility. He filled pages with names, with accounts of endurance, with the minutiae of acts that might otherwise vanish. Each entry was a reclamation, an assertion that their service mattered even if it was ignored by the wider world. He shared these writings with family and community, knowing that recognition in its truest form did not require a headline or a photograph. It required fidelity to memory and courage to speak what had been unseen. The paradox of return was ever present. Home was familiar, yet alien. Safety was assured, yet haunted by remembrance. Gus understood that invisibility did not negate significance. The valor of Black Marines, once overlooked, persisted through survival, through memory, and through the deliberate act of bearing witness. And as he walked the streets of his town, feeling both the weight of what had been endured and the quiet affirmation of resilience, he recognized that the war, in a sense, was not over. It continued in each telling, each reflection, each effort to ensure that the unrecorded courage of men like him remained alive, tangible, and indelible in the consciousness of those willing to listen. Years had passed since Augustus Walker had returned from Iwo Jima, and yet the war remained embedded within him, a persistent echo that refused to fade. The quiet of civilian life was punctuated by memories of black sand and fire, by the relentless rhythm of artillery, by the faces of comrades lost, and the silent acknowledgments owed but never given. Gus had aged, his body carrying the scars of exertion and survival, his mind haunted by the invisible ledger of valor. He revisited letters, photographs, and the notebook he had begun in the trenches, each page a testament to the courage and persistence of those who had been rendered invisible in public memory. The world had moved forward, yet it seemed to do so with selective vision, honoring certain images, certain moments, while countless acts of bravery remained unrecognized. Gus wandered through archives and local museums, searching for fragments of acknowledgement, for traces of the soldiers whose contributions had been essential yet ignored. The exhibits celebrated famous photographs, the raising of the flag atop Mount Suribachi, the iconic moments of triumph. Yet the Black Marines, the men and women who had carried ammunition through hell, who had endured without fanfare, were largely absent. Recognition, it seemed, was still partial, contingent upon visibility rather than substance. Gus felt no anger, only the weight of truth unspoken. His journey was not one of resentment, but of reclamation. The names, the deeds, the presence of those who had endured alongside him demanded remembrance, regardless of the world's willingness to record it. He began to contribute to local archives, offering his notebooks, his detailed accounts, photographs, and letters. Each entry, each recollection, was a quiet assertion that their service mattered, that valor was not diminished by omission. Gus spoke at schools, to small gatherings, to community groups, emphasizing that heroism often exists unseen, in acts of persistence and resilience, in decisions made under duress, in courage that carries on without applause. His voice became a bridge between forgotten sacrifice and the awareness of new generations, a means to ensure that the invisible contributions of Black Marines were inscribed in living memory. Even as he grew older, traveling back to the sites of his service became both ritual and necessity. Iwo Jima was distant, yet in his mind it remained vividly present. The black sands, the cratered landscape, the rhythm of battle that had demanded every ounce of his focus and endurance. He recalled the faces of fallen comrades, the quiet acts of courage that had kept him and others alive. The absence of public acknowledgement weighed upon him still, yet in recounting these memories to those willing to listen, Gus understood that significance did not depend on collective recognition. The acts themselves, preserved in memory and witness, were enduring, undeniable, and sacred. Gus also observed a new generation of Marines, diverse in background, yet facing echoes of challenges he had once endured. Their courage and dedication reminded him that the fight for acknowledgement, for equity, for historical truth, continued beyond the battlefield. The war had ended, yet the struggle to ensure that all voices, especially those long ignored, were heard persisted. His notebook, once a private ledger of experience, became a legacy, a promise that the valor of men and women who had been overlooked would not vanish into obscurity. In the evenings, he would sit quietly, pen in hand, recounting names and deeds, sometimes for hours. The sound of writing was almost ceremonial, a rhythm that echoed the cadence of the battlefield, but transposed into reflection. Each word was deliberate, a refusal to let history overlook them. Gus understood that time would not always bear witness, that recognition would remain partial, yet the act of remembering was itself an act of defiance. Courage had been real, unrecorded though it might be. Resilience had been evident, persistent, even when ignored. And as he closed his notebook each night, he felt a fragile but enduring sense of fulfillment. He had preserved the echoes of those who would otherwise have remained silent, ensuring that their presence, their valor, and their struggle continued to resonate in a world that had too often chosen to look away. The war had taken much, but it had not erased them. Their stories, once invisible, now lived in memory, in testimony, in the deliberate acts of one man determined that their courage would endure. Augustus Walker understood that some battles are fought not on the sands of distant islands, but within remembrance itself, and that victory in this realm required no audience but the steadfast preservation of truth.